Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum everyone. Today in this presentation we are going to talk about national interest, a very important term in the international relations. So let's move on. In this presentation you are going to know the answers of these 5 questions. So what are these questions? The first question is, what is national interest? What is the definition of national interest? And what are the components of national interest? And how we classify national interest? And the last question is, how national interests are achieved, and what are the tools for achieving national interest? So let's move on. First of all, with the introduction, national interest is a very key component in the international relations, but it is also a very vague and ambiguous term. There is no universally accepted definition of national interest. There are many perspectives of national interest. Every thinker or political scientist or international thinker have its own perspective on national interest, as well as the leaders of nations. They have their own perspective of national interest. And what the very vague definition of, or I can say that the very broad definition of national interest can be the national government's goal for securing countries' security, economic well-being, socio-cultural values, military and international political goals is known as national interest. That's the very broad definition of national interest. So let's move on to know about what does it mean by national interest. National interest changes according to the context, time and place. It is decided according to the political environment of that particular time. So there are a few examples here that I have put forward in this presentation for your understanding of national interest. For example, development of nukes by US and USSR in the Cold War era for their own national interest. Well, both the nations were talking about that it is in their national interest to build more and more nukes so that the other nation cannot attack them. So they believed that it is in their national interest to build those nukes. Similarly, USSR's intervention in Afghanistan for Soviet national interest. They were justifying their actions on the basis of national interest. Similarly, Pakistan's development of nukes after India's nuclear testing came under Pakistan's national interest. Similarly, Pakistan justified its nuclear tests on the basis that it is in their national interest to build those nukes. So these are the few examples for understanding national interest, so that you will know what does the national interest means. It changes with time and the political environment of the particular era. So let's move on to the definition of national interest. This is a very broad definition of national interest. Every nation state's national interest is built up with those basic components that are defined as claims, objectives, goals, demands, and interests, which a nation always tries to preserve, protect, defend, and secure in a relations with other nations. Now let's move on to see that how Vernon von Dijk, a political scientist, defines national interest. According to him, national interest is what states seek to protect or achieve in relation to each other. It means desire on the part of sovereign states. So that's the definition of national interest according to Vernon von Dijk. And every other political scientist have its own perspective of national interest. It's a very ambiguous term, and all the political scientists, thinkers have their own view on the national interest, and its definition changes with the time and place and the political environment of that particular time. So that's the very broad definition of national interest. Let's move on to the components of national interest. There are two main components of national interest. One are non-variable interests and the other are variable interests. So the non-variable interests are those interests that doesn't change with the passage of time. According to Morgenthau, these are the most vital components of national interest that a foreign policy seeks to secure its survival or identity. According to Morgenthau, this survival and identity is subdivided into three parts: it's physical identity, political identity, and cultural identity. Every nation tries to protect its identity, either its physical identity, which is also known as its territorial identity, or its political identity, and its cultural identity. So, what are the variable interests of a nation? Variable interests are those interests that change with time and the political environment. According to Vernon von Dijk, his lists include prosperity, peace, ideology, justice, prestige, power. These are the variable interests of a nation. It changes with time, it changes with the circumstances. So these are the two most important components of national interest. National interest contains non-variable and variable components. Now let's discuss the classification of national interest. Well, Thomas W. Robinson classified national interest in these 6 parts. So the first part is the primary interest. These are those interests that no nation can compromise upon. For example, preservation of its physical, political, and cultural identity against other nations. These interests are so vital for any nation state that it will go for war even if it's the need for it. So the second classification of national interest is secondary interests. What are those secondary interests? Secondary interests are less important than those primary interests, but they are quite vital for any nation's existence. What are those secondary interests? Secondary interests can be protection of citizens that live abroad of any nation state, or we can say that diplomatic immunity for its diplomatic staff. These are the secondary interests of any nation. Now let's move on to the third classification, that is permanent interests. So what are the permanent interests? These are relatively long-term interests of any nation, but they are subject to change. They change, but at the very slow pace. For example, the US influence in fight against terrorism, it's a long-term interest. US have a long-term interest in it. Let's move on to the fourth classification. Fourth classification is variable interest. These are vital for national good of any nation, but they are subject to change according to the international political environment. The fifth classification is the general interest. General interests are positive conditions for any nation. They are like economic benefit for any nation, its trade, diplomatic benefit, or maintaining international peace. These are the general interests of any nation. What are the specific interests of any nation? A specific interest is a logical outgrowth of general interests defined in the time and space of a particular political environment. For example, one specific interest of any nation can be to secure third world countries' rights through securing new international economic order. So these are the 6 classification of national interests according to Thomas W. Robinson. So what are the tools for achieving national interest? There are 5 tools for achieving national interest. One is diplomacy, by directly engaging with the other nation. The other can be propaganda, by promoting knowledge and information to other nations and creating such an environment to influence other nation states. Through economic means, which I also call through stick, means that through your economic might you are influencing other nations to follow your pursuit. Through alliances and treaties, that happens a lot. It happens in the international political environment a lot. Countries align and form treaties with each other for balancing the system, and they are doing this to achieve their national interests through coercive means through fight or through economic sanctions, and all these kinds of actions that are happening in the political environment. So these are the 5 tools for achieving national interests. Thank you for watching. For more of those videos, like, comment, share and subscribe. Allah Hafiz.